Hi, Ian Roberts, and welcome to our laboratory of the painting process. Last week I talked about roadmaps, which we could say are like the map of our intention before we begin to paint. And one viewer said, well, doesn't that make our image kind of static, that everything just goes to one place? And of course, you can exaggerate that to pull us into one place so we don't go anywhere else. Or you can not really do it at all and we're wandering around the picture plane not knowing quite where to go. Or like Goldilocks and the Three Bears, we just find that place that has a good balance between the two. But this week I want to talk about diagrams. It's also a drawing technique. That last fall I was teaching a pilot program, an online course on drawing. And the students were having a lot of trouble with one particular image. And I came up with this idea of diagramming because you just figure out where each thing is in space before you begin. Because from my experience walking around the landscape during a plein air workshop, for example, you can see sometimes people just working and reworking and working and reworking something, and it's usually because they're having trouble spatially figuring out where something actually sits. And it just doesn't look right, and they're not sure what the problem is. And you might say, well, we know where everything sits in space. But this thing of three-dimensional perception is actually really interesting. I was just reading a book, Vision and Art, by a professor, Margaret Livingstone. And she's a neurobiologist at Harvard. And she said something that really stopped me. It's like we think of the three-dimensional world out there. We know where everything is. We're here. Everything goes on out there. And she said, actually, we see in two dimensions. The back of our eyeball is a two-dimensional plane. And so the three-dimensional world comes, hits a two-dimensional surface, and then up the optic nerve into our brain, it gets reconstructed as three dimensions. Three dimensions is a learned behavior, just like a child might reach for the moon because they don't have yet any spatial information to know where things are. It's learned. And you could say, well, we have two eyes. That's why we see in three dimensions. But that's true for the first maybe 15, 20 feet. But after that, the effect of it, of those two eyes and how far apart they are, isn't really affecting us particularly. So this idea of carving three dimensions on a two-dimensional surface requires like a grammar or a syntax, just like when we speak. When we want to communicate clearly, we have to use certain structures so the listener understands. And it's the same thing with painting. We have to structure certain very careful relationships at very particular points to make sure that spatially we understand what's going on. Otherwise, we're doing the equivalent of mumbling. So I'm going to draw a diagram now, just to show you what I mean. So in terms of looking at this as a diagram, first, we've got certain things that are happening going back in space. The first thing we encounter is that sort of group of bushes right there, right? And then there's this little pale piece of grass, green grass is here, and then this big mass of trees here. You could almost paint this in with a house painting brush. But the first line that we hit is here, and then this is all on the same plane. And then you see that there's a shadow, very small, running right here. And the next thing is that little narrow strip of field. That becomes really important drawing right here and here in terms of delineating those. And then we've got this line of poplars here, and we have one here, and then we have a couple of them over here. Plus, we have a tree here and a tree here. Those are all on the same plane. And then we have this tiny little sliver, faint, of a field behind here, and then everything else back there is really, we would probably paint in a grayed out green, very simple, to sit simply behind these shapes here and behind that field until we finally get to the mountain far away. So you see how there's a few simple places where we need to delineate where things are sitting in space so that we orchestrate and carve that depth. And the one other thing I'd say is, you see how there's a dark shape of grasses here? I would probably, see how there's several sort of horizontals here? I would be inclined to take that color there and bring it forward something like that. This is more in terms of a road map. And then take this colored grass here and fill that in so that we have a road, we have a pathway into the painting and then back into it from there. So I hope you found that useful. Here's the image that I mentioned at the beginning that the students were having trouble with. You can stop the video and just try doing a diagram of that yourself. It's not really a drawing, it's just a diagram of where things sit in space. And next week, I want to talk more about this idea of foreground, middle ground, and background. And this is true of interiors, still life, and of course landscapes. How each has a role to play to help craft the idea of depth and creating the illusion of 3 dimensions. So I'll see you next Tuesday. Have a great week, and bye for now.